evening to everyone. I am so happy to be here again with you. So this evening, you all know that we are here to listen to John Urschel. I know that most of you already know him, and many of you know a lot about him, but I think you know that he went to Penn State, but he was drafted by the Ravens. And I believe he played for 4 seasons with the Ravens. And he left the Ravens and went back to school so that he could finish working on his doctorate degree. And I believe that in the middle of the pandemic, Mr. Urschel became Dr. Urschel. So we now have with us Dr. Urschel, who now also has a book that you're all going to receive. And I think you'll be excited about receiving this book from this doctor, former football player, which is really confusing, but I'm sure that you all understand that. And without me saying another word, he's going to speak. And after he finishes speaking, then we'll go to the questions that you asked, and you'll have a chance to ask the questions that you sent in. I turn this now over to Dr. Urschel. Thank you.
Dr. Urschel. Thank you for that kind introduction. First, I'm going to share screen. I have some slides for you. The format for this is pretty straightforward. First, I would just like to tell you a little bit about myself, tell you a little bit about football, but mainly talk about how I got into math, sort of my path into mathematics, and what it is I do these days. And lastly, why math is important, not just for me, but for you. And then the second half of this will be sort of opening this up to you all to sort of ask me questions, and for me to sort of like answer whatever's on your mind and try to be a resource for you all. So I have to say that it's a little startling to hear myself sort of described so generously, in that I don't spend a lot of time thinking about the ways in which I'm unique. Sort of my life is sort of the only one I know. It's sort of normal to me. But I do recognize I'm very lucky, first, to have had a chance to pursue my dream of being a professional football player, but also to be able to pursue my dream of being a mathematician. And I've gotten a lot of attention for being a football player because, well, football players get lots of attention. But I think my more interesting story is my story about the story of me sort of moving towards mathematics. And that's really what I'd like to focus on. And this story doesn't really begin with me, but my mother. I inherited my sort of love of math from my mom, along with my height, my stubbornness, and a few other things. And growing up, my mom was actually quite a talented math student. And she wanted to go into some sort of mathematical field, but she didn't think it was possible. Her parents, my grandmother pictured there, and my grandfather, neither of them ever graduated from high school. My grandmother attended school in the basement of a local Black church where sort of one teacher taught all the students, no matter their age. School ended after 8th grade. Both my grandfather and grandmother ended up in Cincinnati, where my grandmother worked as a seamstress and my grandfather worked 2 jobs, the morning shift at a linen and uniform supply company and the afternoon shift at General Motors. My mom attended a public school where the goal was just to graduate, not to sort of expand a student's mind. This was a school with a high dropout rate, but my mom was a really talented math student. And thankfully, she had a couple teachers who recognized it. They let her take classes above her grade level. By the time she entered her senior year, she had taken all the math classes they could offer at her school. And so one teacher helped her enroll in college courses at the University of Cincinnati, her local university. But that was sort of the limit of the encouragement that she got, even when she talked to her guidance counselor. The guidance counselor told her to forget going to college and that she should focus on something more attainable, like being a secretary. Well, it took a lot of courage for her to not listen to this person. And I'm quite glad she did. She applied to the University of Cincinnati, her local university, got in and got a full scholarship. And there she thought she wanted to pursue some mathematical field, maybe engineering or something related. But when she got there, she sort of experienced something. When other people looked at her, they didn't see a doctor, they didn't see an astrophysicist. They saw a young Black woman from a rough part of town. So she started to doubt herself too. She felt like she wasn't prepared enough. She wondered whether she was smart enough, and she needed a job. So she became a nurse, and she worked as a nurse at night in the operating room while putting herself through grad school. She and my dad separated when I was quite young, and my father moved back to Canada. And my mother, as a single mother, sort of knew all too well sort of the world could be a difficult place. But here's a really interesting thing. She made sure that sort of like I, as her son, never felt this way, never felt this way at all. She made sure that no matter what I wanted to do, no matter what I wanted to be, that I never felt like any of my dreams were out of reach. She made sure I never felt like the household I grew up in affected what kind of opportunities I got. And I have to say, by and large, she succeeded. At home, she noticed I had a talent and an interest in math, and she encouraged it. I would devour workbooks that she would get me. I would sort of like play these games. I would just do puzzles at home, sort of like day after day after day. Puzzles like some of the ones I have here on the slide. For instance, I would love doing these sort of like magic sum puzzles where some numbers are filled in and every row, column, and diagonal sums up to a fixed number. So here it's 15. And on the right, a magic product. Same idea, except you multiply numbers in every row or column or diagonal, and they have to multiply for 216. I would spend hours at the kitchen playing Sudoku or board games, games that were developing my sort of my reasoning, my quantitative thinking, my analytical skills, and not to mention my competitive instincts, sort of losing physically pained me in some sense. And she would give me puzzle book after puzzle book. And here's where I really started to sort of glimpse the potential and the beauty of math. I love these puzzle books. I could spend sort of like hours on them, sitting at my little desk, not even noticing time passing. And to me, I especially loved logic puzzles. They were sort of a game, detective stories, or like a treasure hunt. Given a bunch of clues, I would have to deduce a conclusion. And I have to say, I would never really read the lessons at the start of the section or the instructions for completing the problems. I wanted to figure it out for myself. And I have to say, looking back, I realized when I was doing those logic puzzles as a kid, I was training my mind. I was learning how to separate variables, sort of recognize patterns, identify relevant information, and create my own tools and techniques for solving problems. And these are skills that have served me extremely well in my life, not just as a mathematician. I have to say, though, when I got to high school, math and science were still my favorite classes, but I wasn't as interested in them as I used to be. I didn't really sort of like want to do math all day. I wanted to play football. Well, what happened? On one level, it's pretty obvious. Sports are fun, and I sort of craved this sort of competition and the adrenaline and the challenge. I made my best friends in the world through football, and sports can be hard, sometimes even painful, but my teammates and I, we would share that challenge, we would share that pain, and we had a common goal. And of course, sort of as a society, sports are our common culture. When a kid sort of turns on the TV, he or she sees sort of athletes, not mathematicians. They sort of see how desirable it is to be an NFL player, or let's say an NFL or an NBA star. In fact, if you have any athletic talent at all, when you're a kid, people are going to encourage it. I had coaches in my ear motivating me to do, one more rep in the weight room when I thought I was done. I had sort of the example of teammates next to me, sort of putting it on the line. Strangers would come up and encourage me. They would cheer for me, sort of strangers. I'm not talking about the NFL, I'm talking about high school. Needless to say, I didn't have math teachers coaxing one more problem out of me. They weren't calling the Princeton math department and telling them to recruit me the way my high school football coach was calling the Princeton football coach. I didn't have any public mathematicians to inspire me or for me to want to emulate. I actually didn't even know what a mathematician was or what a mathematician did. And then I got to Penn State. My mom's plan for me was to be a rocket scientist. I wasn't thinking too much about it at first. I was really sort of more concerned with proving myself on the football field. Sort of being a Big Ten offensive lineman was a dream of mine since I was a little kid. And to be honest, my engineering classes, they sort of bored me a little bit. They kept focusing on how things worked, which is an important question, but I kept finding myself coming back to the question of why. I didn't want to memorize formulas. I wanted to know how they came up with them in the first place. And as soon as I started taking college math classes, something shifted. Everybody thinks Penn State is a football school, and with good reason. Beaver Stadium fits over 100,000 people, and I have to say I'm sort of convinced we have the best fans in the world. But what most people don't know is Penn State also has a good math department. I took a few math classes, and I sort of felt something in me come alive. There's sort of a beauty and rigor to math that I love. It could be sort of difficult, even frustrating. Don't get me wrong, but beneath the complexity of math, there's a clarity. And here I realized was where I could ask that question, the question of why, and where I could find answers. And what was even more exciting was that some of those answers were ones that no one had ever found before. During my sophomore year in college, I had a professor, a guy by the name of Vadim Koloshin. He's a professor at University of Maryland now. He was a brilliant mathematician, one of the top experts in the world on something called dynamical systems, which are systems that change states over time. Think the weather. One day, Koloshin summoned me to his office and gave me this book, Chaos: An Introduction to Dynamical Systems. He pointed out a challenge at the end of the first chapter. Period 3 implies chaos. And he asked me if I could solve it. At the time, I had only taken basic physics and a few advanced math classes, and this was a graduate textbook. And so to solve this problem, I had to start at the very beginning, not the beginning of the book, but the beginning of the topic. For the entire next week, I spent every spare moment I had trying to catch up. I would read while lying in bed very early, reading late at night, reading while eating at meals, reading while hanging out with my friends, while they played video games. Basically, any moment I wasn't in class, on the practice field, or studying tape, I was trying to solve this problem. After a week of steady work, I was able to produce the proof, and I brought it to Koloshin. Then he suggested another book, even more complicated one, and I checked it out of the library and started reading it. And this would go on for a while. Then he started to give me a few papers to start reading, some math papers related to a particular problem, known as the three-body problem. And he said he had a couple graduate students working on it, but one pulled out, and he asked if I wanted to take on mathematical research. I said yes, and this changed my life. I can assure you, as a high school student, this is not what I thought I was going to spend my free time in college doing, reading math books, working on a problem about outer space. During the bowl game that year, we went to the Outback Bowl. I would read this math book on the way to and from practice. When other people were going out to, going out for extracurricular activities, I was in a coffee shop, glued to my book, trying to figure out just one more thing, excited to read one more page. Eventually, after many months of hard work, we came up with a result, one that was worth publishing. Our aim was to study the dynamics of a Sun-Jupiter asteroid system and show the existence of instabilities in the movement of an asteroid. And we were successful. We were able to show that an asteroid whose initial orbit is far from the orbit of Mars can be generally perturbed into one that crosses Mars's orbit. It was a problem in celestial mechanics, and what excited me wasn't discovering something new about the physical universe. I didn't find Mars inherently interesting. What excited me was the idea of discovering something new. no one had ever proven what we had just shown. And this sort of like sparked my competitive instincts in some sense. There were so many unanswered questions, sort of a whole theoretical universe to understand. And it was that moment right then that I knew I wanted to become a mathematician. When I was a teenager, I had a lot of aggression, and I sort of loved the feeling I got when I was blocking during football games. I sort of craved this physical challenge. And frankly, I just sort of loved running around on the football field and hitting people, and I didn't know any feeling like it. And I have to say, that feeling that mathematical research gave me was sort of as thrilling and unmatchable, if not more so, but in a different way. The challenge of sort of solving an open problem, a difficult sort of attempt to sort of master high level concepts and to sort of like make connections and map new territories of understanding, there's nothing like it. And the beauty of it is that there's a rigor to it. Anytime I would try to sort of make a claim, I had to understand every step of a solution or the whole thing would fall apart. I would have to prove it. And well, since that first research paper, a lot's happened. I did indeed get drafted into the NFL, and I played 3 years for the Baltimore Ravens. While playing in the NFL, I have to say, I again felt this sort of pull of math. I was playing the first year in the league, playing for the Ravens and doing well, but not being in a in a university, not sort of taking classes, not reading academic papers, not talking to people. This got to me a little bit, and I apply to MIT for a PhD in math after my first year in the league. And I have to say that while I'm finishing up my PhD now, and next year I'll be starting a postdoctoral position at Princeton, but during my time at MIT, I sort of fell in love with math even more. Being at a place full of sort of such talented individuals who just love math and love talking about these things, there's really nothing like it. And I have to say that so while at MIT, I realized sort of all the amazing things you can do with math. And so what I'd like to do is sort of give you a little brief introduction into the sort of things I do with math these days. So these days, I work on something called linear algebra, which for middle school students, these symbols, these X's and these Y's might look a little abstract, but for high school students who have taken algebra, I have a 2x2 system of linear equations, 2x plus 3y equals 16, x plus y equals 7, and perhaps you want to solve for x and y. Well, in algebra, they teach you how to do this, but more generally, you can think about systems of linear equations as these sort of large arrays that you can sort of solve rather than thinking about two equations and two unknowns. Maybe you need to solve a problem with a billion equations and a billion unknowns. And well, we can't do this by hand, and we have to rely on computers. And this area of linear algebra is fundamentally concerned with solving two types of equations: linear systems, which are sort of generalizations of what I just showed you, and eigenvalue problems, which, given an array of numbers, can tell you something about how those numbers behave. And these sort of problems actually show up in a wide range of applications. So maybe you're interested in things like differential equations. Maybe you want to be an engineer. Well, it turns out that in practice, if you're an engineer and you want to solve something like a heat equation, well, in practice, you often can't solve this problem by hand, and you need to make use of some sort of discretization, which leads you to a linear system, which leads you to me. Or maybe you're into data science, and you want to take big data sets and try to make some conclusions from them. Well, then something useful for you might be something called principal component analysis, where you take a large data set and you compute something called eigenvalues of some representation of that data set, which tells you things about your data. And so this is just a little sort of basic view of the sort of things that I work on while I'm at MIT and how these things might connect to sort of subjects like engineering or data science. And you don't have to be sort of a researcher in math to know how important math is. So I have to say, I'm a big fan of these XKCD comics and making use of them. And so a more general question is, why does math matter for you? Well, suppose you want to be a scientist of some sort. Suppose you want to be a biologist, a chemist, a physicist, an engineer. It turns out that, well, surprise, surprise, math is sort of the foundation of all these things, because math is sort of the language of sort of talking quantitatively. And so it's quite hard to do things in biology or chemistry or physics if you don't have sort of like a strong basic foundation in math. And more generally, suppose you're interested in being a data scientist, or suppose you're just interested in making good sort of well-reasoned decisions. It turns out that, to the surprise of perhaps no one, numbers remain the best system for determining which of two things are larger. Or you can think more generally, quantitative reasoning sort of remains one of the best ways to try to make a decision. For instance, mathematical concepts that can help you in your daily life are things like understanding the difference between correlation and causation. Understanding how to read sort of like some statistic that you might see in the newspaper, how to understand what they're really saying, how to read a bar plot, a pie chart, how to sort of take in statistics and really sort of think to yourself, is this saying what I actually think it's saying, or am I being misled? And I can tell you that if you don't have a strong foundation in math, you're much more likely to be misled by sort of false information. And I hope that sort of from this sort of like introductory presentation, I hope you sort of take something from this. Maybe you can connect personally to my experiences about, sort of, maybe you aspire to be a scientist, or you aspire to be, to do something in STEM. Or maybe you've realized that the world we live in is an increasingly quantitative one. It isn't just sort of like, mathematics isn't just beautiful or interesting. In my opinion, mathematics isn't just a powerful, practical tool. Math is a necessary one. That's all I have for you all, but I hear you have some questions for me. And if you think up any questions from sort of what I showed you now, I think once you get through the prepared questions, feel free to ask me any additional questions that come to mind. So.